Hi guys, feel free to pop your cameras on if you're not too self-conscious. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up in there if you can hear me all right. Fantastic. Excellent, excellent. I know that quite a few people had emailed a little bit earlier who were not going to be able to make it today. So we have got this recording, so we will make it available to everyone. There are still a few people actually wanting to join, so I shall just let them in as well. But thank you very much once again, everyone, for joining us, especially on a Friday afternoon / evening. Really, really good to see you all here. Today, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be focusing much more on the actual work side of things, as opposed to getting used to going into China and finding your way. We're going to be concentrating a lot more on what life is like teaching in a classroom in China, what some of the issues are that you're going to come up against whilst doing that. I am going to talk a fair bit from experience with this. I myself came up against many different little things that I struggled with throughout my time living, working and teaching in China. Hopefully some of those challenges will prove useful to some of those who are here today. But first of all, what I'd just like to kick off with is just a little bit of a poll to see what your broad concerns are, what most people here are most concerned about living, teaching in China, what most people feel is going to be their biggest challenge, if you like. So I'm just going to quickly launch a little poll here and let's see what we come back with. Okay. Interesting. That's very interesting. That's a pretty comprehensive vote for the language barrier that's come in there. I'm actually a tiny little bit surprised. One of the things that a lot of people tend to struggle with when they first get to China is the behavior of the children, actually how students end up behaving. Students in China can be very, very excitable, particularly with their foreign teachers. As we covered yesterday in our last session, as we covered last Friday in our session, China is a very broadly homogenous country. And so having a teacher who is a foreign teacher, who looks so different, who seems to be so different, can sometimes encourage what we call a little bit of overexcitability among students in China, which can sometimes be a little bit of an issue for a lot of new teachers who are coming there. So I think you might find that that initial answer to your question, where the majority of you said the language barrier, I reckon I would put quite a bit of money on that answer changing within the first 2 weeks of you being there to behavior. The language barrier in and of itself actually is one of the things that, although it seems daunting at first, can actually be relatively easy to challenge, come up against and get over. I remember when I was moving to China, it seems just so long ago now for me, but I was myself concerned before I left about the language barrier, about the students not being able to understand what I was saying, and mostly thinking to myself, well, I don't speak any Chinese at all. The students I'm going to be teaching are going to be quite young. I'm assuming their English isn't going to be very good. How the hell am I going to be able to teach these students English? And the answer to that comes in a few little sections, actually, that all go with the job. So one is your TAs, your teaching assistants in China. So you're all going to have English language teaching assistants who are bilingual in English and in Chinese. Now, you may wish to use them to a lesser or greater extent, and this comes into the next section, which is how the classroom is structured in and of itself. So if you're going to be teaching within a public school, you're going to have a broad guideline, which is roughly going to be your lessons are going to be catching students up with the native teacher on what their lessons had been previously. So you'll be designing your own lessons around the lessons that their Chinese English teacher has been teaching them before. So you'll have the opportunity to watch these lessons. A lot of the vocabulary they've already learned, they will already know. And there are quite a lot of rigid structures for teaching. So a lot of it is based on song. A lot of it is based on communication with them. So encouraging them to talk. And a lot of it is based on calls and responses that are kind of drilled into them. Kids, especially from the ages of 4 to 16, are basically sponges. And a huge amount of the vocabulary they learn in lesson, they pick up very quickly. You will be surprised at how quickly you're able to keep order in class if you use a particular set of calls and instructions. I'm going to be going a lot more in depth with that when we do our training days. And we actually talk a lot more about the precise tools and techniques that you can use in a classroom. So don't panic about the language barrier. It's genuinely the biggest red herring that we tend to find that people worry about before they go there. The bigger worrier for you, I reckon, is going to be the behavior of students. It's going to be that excitability that they're going to have. It can be super fun at first, as I mentioned in the last one, especially if you've got small class sizes. The temptation is to play around with them and be their mate as much as you can. But it's important to learn certain ordering and classroom techniques with that as well. But thank you guys very much for filling that out. That was interesting to see at the moment. Hopefully that might allay a few fears that you might have at present about the language barrier coming in. Now, what I want to do before we kick off in earnest today is just take a quick little look at an update that some of you might have seen over the last couple of days. There have been quite a few sensationalist news reports in magazines essentially saying China's borders are now open. Although that is somewhat a quarter truth, we do need to look at this through the lens of, okay, who is it open for? When is it going to be open? And think about it realistically. So you can see here on the Danish embassy website for China, they'd released a notice that due to the rapid spread of COVID-19 balancing out, China is now facilitating visas for those who already hold residence permits in China. Now, a residence permit in China is what you attain after you go to China. So this isn't your Z visa when you go out or any of the application letters that you would get when you go out when making an application. This applies purely for those who were in China, who had their residence permit in their passport, who left and are now looking at coming back. This is for pretty much every country in Europe that they're trialing this at the moment. Now, I don't want to sound like, you know, this is being pessimistic or bursting any bubbles, because this is a really, really encouraging sign. This is a very, very encouraging sign, because what it's showing is it's showing that they are now looking at actually allowing foreigners in from a vast number of countries and in Europe. Unfortunately, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa aren't there just yet, but the UK and Ireland are, which is really, really good news for those of you who are from there. We have been in contact with our colleagues at our partner schools, getting a bit of a clearer idea as to what this means and how this is going to look going forward. It's important to note as well that China has now opened the channel for South Korean students and those who are looking to work full-time in China to apply for visas. So the next step would seem to be, in terms of opening up, that these European countries would be granted that as well. We don't know yet how long that is going to be. It might still be a month or two. It might be a few weeks. But we do get this news very quickly. We do keep on top of this news very quickly. This is incredibly encouraging and really good. We didn't expect a sign like this to come in August. We were expecting something to come in September, perhaps. So this is a really, really, really good sign, and it shows that things are moving forward. And hopefully, so long as the situation continues to be stable, it means that in a relatively short period of time, we should hopefully be able to have the door open for visa applications to be made and for you to be able to fly to China as well when the flight restrictions begin to be lifted in a much larger sense, which still currently looks like it's going to be in October, which is very, very, very good news. So let's take a look now at our presentation for today. We are going to be focusing on Teaching in China, we're going to be focused on working life as a teacher in China, what you can expect from your role as a teacher in China, and what some of those challenges are going to be, and how you can best look to overcome them. So let's crack on. We're going to be taking a look, first of all, at the history of education in China. It's really important to talk from a little bit of a historical context about this, so you can get a bit of a grounding and a bit of a broader idea as to why China's education system is as it is, why there's so much importance that's placed on education in China. We'll talk a little bit about in-class challenges, and I'll give a bit of an overview as to how you can overcome some of these. As I mentioned, when we do our training days at the end of the month and in September, we're going to actually practice a lot of these techniques that are used for controlling classes, that are used for getting more immediate results from students when you're coming in and you might be feeling a little bit nervous. We're going to be speaking as well about teacher expectations, about what's going to be expected of you as a teacher in China. There are certain expectations that might be unexpected for people when they're going over to teach in China. The expectations for foreign teachers, particularly in China, are very different to the expectations that are placed on native Chinese teachers, and also very different to the kinds of expectations that are placed on teachers in the West as well. It's a very unique job in and of itself. And we are also going to be looking at cultural awareness in the workplace. So we're going to be taking a look at a few key things, a few key challenges that there might be in terms of cultural awareness, in terms of things to understand about China when you're at work with Chinese colleagues, as well as with Western colleagues, to be completely honest, in your workplace, who are expats in China. So, education in China. Well, historically, education in China has been absolutely enormous. It's been a key point of China's 5,000 years of continuous civilization. It is probably the most educationally dedicated culture in the world. East Asia as a whole places a tremendous amount of emphasis on education. But within China, there is a distinct area that's particularly important, which is Confucianism, and the notions of education, morality, and respect, which are three of the foundational pillars of Confucianism as an ideology. Confucianism comes from Confucius, who in very ancient China essentially laid out the groundwork and framework for China's political, educational, and societal norms and morality. It's very much the equivalent of the church in the West in terms of how important this guy and his philosophies are and were. Within China, they still underpin so much, whether it comes to things like filial piety with respect for parents, grandparents, elders, and authority, whether it comes to the importance of education and meritocracy. It wasn't until very recently that students in China every student in China had to sit a series of very tough exams throughout their entire life in order to decide whether or not they would go into the civil service and become a member of government. China still employs, really, to be honest, a watered down system that is the equivalent of that. In China, there is a lot less inherited positions of privilege, and there are a lot more positions of privilege that are attained through merit, which is done through education, which is done through grading, and that holds very true in the pressure that is placed on students still to do well in their exams. Their life will be dependent on their standard of education, on the grades that they are going to receive, on how they can practice what they have learned. And this very much includes English. And it also includes a mastery of English. You'll often find Chinese students and parents are very, very keen for their kids to speak like a native speaker, because they are in pursuit of that level of excellence. They're in pursuit of that level of high attainment, because that is what everything in China is built upon. You also will have, it's also there's a core of ancient Chinese education practice that still does exist within China in a normal sense. And a lot of this comes into a kind of rote system of learning that's very different to how we are taught in the West. I'll go into this a little bit more in a moment, but suffice to say, a lot of the way students are educated in China is by memorizing things, and is by having a formula by which they are expected to perfect and repeat. A lot of this comes down even to the way in which Chinese writing is done and how you learn Chinese characters. You learn Chinese characters by doing particular strokes, by doing strokes in a particular order. And if you get the order wrong, then you simply will not accept that as something you've written, and you have to start again. So there is a really rigid structure of doing things correctly in China, which underpins why education is so important in the country. Now, it's also important to speak about education in the context of the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, the most revolutionary take on Chinese history. Now, there's a huge amount of really interesting stuff and really interesting arguments as to whether the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China is actually just another dynasty within these 5,000 years of continuous civilization. But there were certain changes that were made to this ancient system by Mao, and that have been reformed and changed and mixed all around by the previous governments and successive governments that there have been in the People's Republic. In 1949, the formation of the People's Republic of China happened. During this time, creative subjects, intellectual subjects were broadly seen as being relatively wasteful and bourgeois, things that were meant for people who were supposed to be in areas of privilege, and they really wanted to do away with all of this and make education incredibly functional in what was already, to be completely fair, a relatively functional educational society in and of itself. There's an emphasis that was placed on precise skill learning, and this was really, really, really heavily important for people to go out, learn to be engineers, learn to be mechanics, and build up the country, make it strong, make it powerful. During this time as well, the Cultural Revolution occurred. During the Cultural Revolution, there was a huge dismantling of the education system in China. There was a huge amount of ridding of the old norms, the old ways of doing things, which was really quite tragic for a lot of people within China. A lot of young people were sent away to the fields, to the countryside, to sow crops, to live as the peasants lived. And a lot of people were taken out of education during the 60s and 70s in order to do this. A lot of the exams were also cancelled during this time as well. This led to what is sometimes described as a bit of an educational deficit among a particular generation, and a particular generation that is very much in power now. Because of this particular generation, so Chinese who are between the ages of, say, 50 to 70, pass down to their children the urgency of importance in education. And this enabled a huge amount of funding to be placed in education post Cultural Revolution, but particularly within the last 20 years, there's been a huge amount of funding that's been had, as a lot of this academic thought during this time was stifled. A lot of academics were very scared to even go into a profession of teaching. And this really brings about the reform that happened at the end of the 70s. In 1979, there's a period called reform and opening up in China. This was begun in earnest by Mao's effective successor, Deng Xiaoping, as the paramount leader of China. Reform and opening up was economic, but it was also, to some extent, social, particularly within the fields of education. Development of a well-funded and comprehensive education system lie at the heart of reform and opening up, but this process of reform and opening up and the education system having more funding ploughed into it has been particularly prevalent within the last 20 years. Many more schools were built, the facilities were improved. Within the last 10 years, the modernization of classrooms within first, second and third tier cities in China far surpasses that of classrooms in the West. Although class sizes are still relatively large, one of the things that you will probably be quite surprised by, especially if you're working within a public school, is just how well equipped a lot of these classes are, how well disciplined they are, how new and how state of the art a lot of the facilities that you are going to experience will be. A lot of this is to promote an international and global facing China, and has a lot to do with the growth of the middle class in the country and a return to investing in those traditional educational values that we mentioned earlier. After the Cultural Revolution, exams were placed back in as being a very core component of a Chinese person's life. There are two very key exams that Chinese students will face. One is the Zhongkao, which Chinese students will face at the end of their time in middle school and will decide where they go to in high school or if they're able to continue. And the most pressured examination is called the Gaokao, which Chinese students sit at the end of high school, basically their equivalent of A levels, but a huge lot harder. And the Gaokao will essentially decide which universities they will be able to be admitted to. It will essentially decide the course of the rest of their life, with China being the meritocratic society it is and the importance that's placed on education and grades in and of itself. When it comes to English in China, English is one of the three core subjects that Chinese learn. Chinese learn Chinese language, mathematics, and English as the three core elements of their curriculum. When they go to middle school, when they go to high school, they can choose to take either a scientific supplementary set of courses, or they can choose to take a more humanities and sort of social and politics-y based set of supplementary subjects. But English is always there. Every single student in China has to learn English, with a few very special exceptions for those in particular international or foreign language schools where they learn another language. But English is absolutely core to pretty much every single Chinese student. But not just Chinese students, also students who are significantly older. There are 300 million English language learners in China. Nearly 5 times the entire population of the United Kingdom are currently learning English in China, which gives you a little bit of an idea as to how and why English teachers, and particularly foreign and native teachers, are so desired to come to China. A lot of this has to do with giving students a leg up in the first place, both so they can sit and excel in their exams, but also due to this new global facing nature that China is seeking to promote. They want their students to be able to communicate with people who are not Chinese, who do not come from that homogenous 92% Han, pretty much 8% other Chinese ethnic minority group. And it's incredibly important that they're able to do this. In 2016, the ASEAN nations adopted English as an official language, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which China is the most important trading partner. Large class sizes and rote learning is still very much prevalent in the teaching of English, which means due to that stuck in the old way of learning by this rote system, communication and failings of individual attention due to large class sizes and due to this very traditional historical way of memorization, rote learning, means that there's a lack of knowledge from older generations to be able to pass on certain key components or certain key skills to students when it comes to communicating effectively with those from other countries to be able to master those language skills. And there has from that become an enormous demand for outward mobility within China. So Chinese students looking to go abroad, people who are looking to set up businesses abroad who are coming from China, people who are looking to go into diplomatic spheres and really promote China to the rest of the world. Probably now more than ever, this has been more important. And you begin right from the very bottom, right from the earliest stages of education with this. So if anyone has any questions on education in China, please do feel free to pop them down here just for the moment. What I'm going to do as well is just launch another quick poll. I do see I have a question here as well. I'm just going to quickly launch another poll. which is, what do you think will be the biggest differences between China and the West in education? So I'm just going to pop this one out here. I see I've got a question from Nathan. How strict does a teacher expect me to be based on other teachers? This is a really good question, Nathan. So when it comes to discipline in China, and I will cover this a little more in a moment as well, the teachers themselves will exercise a level of strictness and a level of severity in the tone in which they teach and the order in which they keep a class that will be very different to what we'll experience in the UK. It's not quite so passive. There is an expectation that is placed on students that is done at the very beginning of lessons, where students will be drilled. They will come into a class, they will have a drill to sit down, they will have a drill to look at the teacher, they will have a drill to focus on the teacher, and a teacher will use much more of a kind of lecture format traditionally. Now, when you're encouraging communication, of course, this is quite hard to be able to maintain. What's important is, when it comes to strictness, make sure you have these drills in mind. And I'm going to be teaching you some of these really, really useful, handy drills in our sessions to come in the future, where I'll be teaching the precise skills that you're going to need to use in a private language centre or a public school. And we'll practice all of these together. But what I would say is, it's less about being strict, but it's more about keeping order. And it's also a lot about knowing a call and response from the students. Chinese students are very used to being told exactly what to do. Give you an example. When I was teaching, I would use a thing called the magic V. They always knew what the magic V was. When I put my hands out like this, it meant they needed to look at me and have my attention. So when I'd say magic V, and I'd teach them in the very first class, I'd say, okay, when I say magic V and put my arms out like this, you say, look at me. And you shut your mouth, arms crossed, and looking straight at me. I say magic V, and then you have 40 children who go, look at me, and they sit like that, which is really, really a magical, wonderful, fantastic thing to do. And so it's really important that you have these calls and responses in place. It's not necessarily about being strict, it's about having that discipline in place from the first time. We'll go into that a lot more. So what do you think the main differences are between education in China and education in the West? So we've got a pretty comprehensive, although again, it's relatively close, between pressure and workload for the students. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I really would say those two things are the biggest differences between education in the UK and the West broadly, and education in China. The pressure is a lot larger, and a lot of the reason for that is what I explained earlier. Their workload is also a lot heavier, but your workload in and of itself isn't. I see no one put workload for teachers. To be honest, that's pretty much true for public school and private language centre teachers. There may be some homework marking to do on occasion, but broadly that's done by their Chinese teachers. Your lessons in and of themselves, students you will go to the student's classroom and teach each group itself. It's very separated, and also it's quite structured as well. So students will very often have the same lessons as each other. So it's relatively easy to be able to handle that workload, because if, say, you have 2 grade 7 classes, you will use exactly the same lesson for your first grade 7 class, you will for your second grade 7 class. And the workload is actually quite a bit easier to handle because of that. Funding and facilities, a couple of people have popped that in there as well. Yeah, you know what, to be honest, that's very true. It does depend where you are in China. I did mention first, second, and the richer third tier cities in China. You'll see the facilities are just really good, really, really good. But the class sizes are much larger as well. And it's important to bear that in mind. And these facilities are sometimes needed for that. And discipline, again, I think I covered that in the question, the answer to Nathan about that. It's not necessarily about being strict, about shouting all the time, but it's about setting ground rules. It's about telling them exactly what they need to do. And it's about being confident in yourself to be able to be a leader. Within China, if you're a teacher, you are very importantly a leader for them. And you need to be a little bit dictatorial with your classroom in terms of how they look, when they come in and what they say to you. Um, but it's important not to lose your temper, because the moment you lose your temper or start, shouting and screaming, that's the moment discipline really, really runs away. Great. Okay. Well, let's continue then. So we're going to take a little bit of a look now at what life is like in school in China. So what are the types of schools within China, broadly speaking, that most people are educated within? You've got public schools, first of all, that many of you are going to be teaching within. Public schools in China, very, very large institutions. You'll see all around cities, huge high-rises that are built up in order to accommodate because of a lack of space within cities. Schools are the exception to the rule of having to build up. Schools within China, particularly in first, second, and well-developed third-tier cities, take up a huge amount of very valuable space within the cities in which they're based, which again shows you the value that is placed in schools in China. They have large classrooms, large dining halls, and large recreational areas for the students to go to as well. Private language centres, the second most common, the ones that most of you are going to be going to yourselves. Within private language centres in China, these are very well equipped small centres. They can range from being the size of a relatively small office to being absolutely enormous, almost the size of primary schools in and of themselves. There are many different franchises. Some are excellent and some are very poor and very bad and treat teachers and students appallingly. We, as an experienced organisation, run a very tight due diligence with all of the schools and organisations we work with private language centres. All of the private language centres that we work with have experience with our teachers before, and all have excellent levels of taking care of teachers, being honest and promoting things correctly to their students, promoting their teachers correctly to the students, and also promoting the courses that they have correctly to the students. Within private language centres and the private language centres that we work with, they will have their own curriculums, which are very often Western developed curriculums. Many of the private language centres are franchises and have the same curriculum for many of the centres all across the country. Others are more localised and have their own that is developed by their own in-house management team. Many teachers that we have who go on the graduate programme end up getting promoted into management teams within private language centres and help with things like curriculum development. So it's a really interesting area to want to get into if you're looking at the kind of for-profit education area. There are, of course, as well, universities where students will go to learn subjects for their degrees, but most universities will also have facilities for students to be able to learn conversational English as well. There are also international and bilingual schools within China. These are schools that are privately owned, that generally study IB curriculums, international baccalaureate curriculums, and will, and in many cases, have very high proportions of foreign teachers teaching at them, sometimes a sort of 80% foreign teacher, 20% Chinese teacher split. And what are the challenges within the classroom that most people will tend to experience? First of all, of course, is excitement, sometimes a little too much. The best way to deal with this, as I mentioned, is having these calls and responses, having this structure put in place for your classes immediately as soon as you go in. Among younger years, a struggle to distinguish between work and play when you're doing active lessons. This is a particularly challenging thing for those working in public schools and private language centres. Because the English language that you're going to be teaching is going to be quite heavily based on things like song, on things like games, on things like activities. Again, having a structure and making sure that students, when they come into your class, are aware of the rules, are aware of the expectations that are placed on them is incredibly important when it comes to this. Also ensuring that you are reviewing and checking any guidelines that you're given, particularly at a private education centre, of their internal curriculum, and paying very close attention to what other teachers are doing as well. Relying on your colleagues, particularly your Western colleagues, other expats, is very important when teaching younger years. making sure you ask as many questions as possible about the challenges that they have, making sure you ask your teaching colleagues, Chinese teaching colleagues and Western teaching colleagues about any difficult students who are in particular classes as well is incredibly important. There's also the opposite end of the spectrum, which is shyness and insulation, with students who can be quite insular looking. Unfortunately, in China, due to a lot of class sizes much of the time, these students sometimes find their way at the back, and teachers will rarely want to move them to the front for them to be able to practice better. Now, keep an eye out within your first few weeks of teaching as to who are the students that are sat at the back looking at their pencil, distracted, talking to their friends, and take the initiative yourself to move them towards the front of the class. This is a big difference between Chinese education and Western education, but also the type of education you're going to be doing. You really want these students to be able to communicate. And one of the big parts of that is having them close to you. Chinese teachers tend to like to keep their best students towards the front because essentially they're their students that are going to do well, and there's a bit of a kind of cut-off point for the others. But for you, you're going to really want to concentrate on keeping those students who are more distracted towards the front. As well as that, within private language centres, this can feel like it's a little bit easier for you. But if you have a class of, say, 7 students and 2 of them find it particularly difficult and bring down the level of attainment of the rest of the class, it's important to look out for those students as well. And important when students are doing their exercises, when you give them a break to write something down, that you come over and talk more to those students, pay more attention to those students that seem shyer and have that more insular kind of attitude. There are, of course, as well, wildly varying expectations that come from these classes. We work with students as well who come over to the UK from public schools in China. I dealt with a student who was absolutely distraught, in tears, inconsolable, because he came second in his class in its rankings out of 50 students, and he had always come first. This level of pressure and this level of expectation among particular students can be difficult to deal with sometimes. But remember to stick to what you are looking to do, which is to teach the whole class as it is. Keep those students that struggle closest to you, and those students that excel, let them fly a little bit more and encourage them to speak and encourage them to sit next to students that are struggling too. Bringing students out of hiding is very important, and it takes a particular kind of character. Now, this is where you balance things. Yes, you need to have the structure, you need to have the discipline at the very start of your lesson in order to make sure students are encouraged, in order to make sure students are focused and paying attention to you. But you also need to be loud, really loud, and you also need to be engaging. You need to use a whole lot of body language. You need to use humor within your classes to be able to engage them, to be able to get them to feel confident, as if they want to speak and they want to learn, they want to say something. You see, you're constantly balancing this act of keeping focus with getting them interested and wanting to speak to you. You got to remember as well that a huge amount of these students are used to there being one right answer to something. So getting them to engage in a small talk conversation can feel like an impossible task at the beginning. So give them a formula at the beginning. Let them fill in gaps, for instance, in sentences with words that they might want to use. Again, we'll go way more into this, but say if you write on the board, the X giraffe was sitting by the X pond, and show them a picture of a yellow giraffe sitting by a blue pond. And then what you can do is take away that picture and ask them to imagine what color the giraffe is, how big the giraffe is, go through lots of adjectives to describe the giraffe and the pond, and get them to write their own ones. The most important thing is getting them to write their own ones, because otherwise what they'll do is they'll all just write the same things. They're used to there being one right answer to a question. You need to take away the idea of there being a single right answer to every single question within that. And because of a lot of this, very strong, bold, loud, outgoing personalities are needed for it. If you are a shy and retiring person, you need to really turn that up and get into a performative mindset when you're in front of a class in China. You need to really, really use all your energy in order to have that class's focus and in order to be able to best impart knowledge to them and encourage them to be able to feel confident in speaking up within classes themselves. Parents. So parents within language centres are much more of a prevalent thing. Within public schools and international schools, you might occasionally come across them. There might be parents' evenings and things where you talk to them. But language centres is where you're really going to experience parents. This picture here pretty much demonstrates exactly what the difference between, I think, East and West is. Within China, it's this picture here. The pressure is placed on the child. In the West, it's broadly placed on the teacher, which sounds like very good news for you as a teacher. But actually, there is a lot of pressure that comes with this. Because of the high expectations that are placed on their children, if you're in a language centre, very often you'll be talking to every single parent after every single class and informing them of how well their students have done. And parents can be quite strict and severe with students. So making sure that you are so when you're speaking with the parents, it's very often done through a translator who may well do this on your behalf sometimes. But making sure you are being diplomatic in how you're describing a student's behaviour, and making sure that you get very directly to the points in their education that need improving as opposed to necessarily their behaviour. Sometimes what you'll get with a lot of parents is a parent coming back to you and saying, yeah, no, my kid's not good at this because he's naughty. So focusing less on the behaviour and more on what they got wrong and how they can get it right. So saying, Tim really struggled today when we were doing our speaking sections. And then Tim's dad might say to me through a translator, yeah, no, that's because Tim, he doesn't pay attention to anything. He never pays attention. So you can cut off that point, which is relatively unhelpful for you to wanting to improve it, by saying, maybe at home, if you or someone else could read this line here and ask Tim to read back to you this one, once he's practiced, he might feel more confident in responding to these questions to me back home. So giving the parents something that they can do, as opposed to necessarily just saying to the parents, here's what they did wrong, because very often the parents will just say, you're not concentrating enough, go home and write 500 lines in English, which isn't helping with the particular problem that the student's having in the first place. Sometimes as well, parents can give out what can seem to be relatively contradictory or confusing requirements for their kids. You might have a class of 7 children and 5 parents will come up to you and ask you to do something that's completely unrelated to the course that you're doing with their students at a time where you're supposed to be teaching 6 other students as well. And that can feel really intimidating. It can feel like there's a lot of pressure being put on you. What's important to do at this point is address this with parents by saying, okay, what I will do is, and then say something that you're going to be doing from that lesson that is connected to this. So they might come to you and say, my kid has this homework that he needs to do for school about badgers. Can you talk about badgers? But you're doing a lesson where there is a particular animal and you can say, okay, well, what we're going to be doing is, in here it says, it's talking about a badger and his feelings when he's feeling sad or when he's feeling happy. In our lesson, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing all about the colours of different animals. But what we can do is we can talk about how the animals look in their faces, in the pictures as well, to see how they're feeling. And very often that'll work. But it's very important that you address these requirements without giving in to them necessarily. So saying what you can do, as opposed to saying either, yeah, I can teach your student their school homework that they're doing whilst I'm teaching 6 other kids, or simply saying to them, no, I'm not going to do that. Because again, saying no in China can sometimes be quite difficult. And if you're at a private language centre, the parents are the ones who are paying as well. We will go more in depth again about how we can do that in our precise training sessions on that. Does anyone have any questions to any of those challenges in the classroom in China? Feel free to unmute yourselves as well. if you want to ask a question straight off. Okie dokie. Okay. Let's move on now then to the expectations that are placed on foreign teachers in China. So, oh, sorry, there's someone who dropped out and needs to come back again. There we go. Great. So when it comes to expectations that are placed on foreign teachers in China, it's important to understand why, as a foreign teacher, you are there. What is your purpose? Your main purpose is to lift the standard of English, to keep up the academic progress in other areas. So your goal is to perfect, to challenge, and to create a broader environment for students to be able to learn English in. Encourage communication in spoken English. Now, this is really, really important. They're going to be relying a lot less on you for things like reading and writing, unless you're going to, say, a language centre that has a specialised area in reading and writing. And they're going to be much more focused on communication and speaking. The more your students are speaking English, the better. Within their classes, within their Chinese English classes, they're going to be calling and they're going to be repeating. The more you're getting them singing songs, the more you're getting them participating in group work, speaking with one another, the more you are getting them participating in answering questions to you in a very quick pop way is very important. And the more you're getting groups, if you're in a public school in China, you tend to use the rows of chairs they're sitting in, to participate in competitions where those who are saying the most win, the better as well. There is a perceived shortfall in speaking and communication in China, and it's really there, to be completely honest. Within an education system that excels so much in so many areas, English language and spoken English language really does fall behind. Even the reading and writing ability of Chinese students is excellent, but their spoken ability remains very poor. Among older students, there is a little bit more of an emphasis within middle school and high school, and among adult students, to improve confidence, grammar, and communication skills. So they, as an individual, feel they are going to be more confident in studying abroad, working abroad, having the ability to be able to live abroad as well. Younger students, the important thing is to give that strong native speaking foundation to their education. From an early age, have them practicing their spoken English at you. Have them calling and respond, have them coming up with their own ideas, their own words for things. Again, like I say, using those gaps within sentences for them to come up with their own adjectives, to come up with their own nouns, to come up with their own verbs for something that they're describing is a really important foundational building block before eventually giving them the ability to be able to come up with their own narratives, structures, and ability to communicate in conversations. With teens and adults, there is also sometimes a bit of an emphasis to include things like business English and communication and things like that, but this isn't going to be particularly relevant to the majority of you. There are personality expectations that are expected among teachers in China. These expectations are, in my opinion, also absolute requirements for teachers in China. You'll need to be engaging, high energy and fun. You've got to have a plan for each of your classes, and that plan has to involve games, activities, things that are getting their students to actively engage in your class as opposed to just listening to you and repeating what you're saying out loud. You've got to be able to hold the attention of an individual within a large group. Some of this comes down to a differentiated approach to learning, seeing the students that are paying attention to you within your first few weeks and seeing those that aren't. And again, moving those students that aren't closer to you and focusing on those students at times where students are doing writing activities or down activities, paying more attention to them and building up that confidence in them so that they maintain attention within classes. You also need to be able to accurately work with teaching materials for students. So familiarizing yourself within the first few weeks, asking as many questions as you possibly can of your Chinese colleagues and Western colleagues about what materials you need, how best to use those materials, and how, and training on things like using big new PowerPoint presentations, different software that might be in Chinese. There is going to be training that's going to be made available for you, but remember, question everything. Make sure during your initial orientation training that you are writing down questions at every stage that you need to ask, and also relying on teachers who have already been there for a long time for assistance and help whenever and however you need that. Importantly as well, you're going to need to be able to display patience and care with your students. Making sure that you are not getting carried away by pushing them too hard. This can be a real temptation, and a lot of this comes from that level of expectation that is placed on the students that can trickle down and you can feel yourself. Parents might say, we expect our child to be able to do this really quickly. Make sure a parent knows that patience is key to this. They're just learning in a different way. Never push your class beyond what they are achieving at any one particular time as well. There can sometimes feel like there is a lot of pressure coming down on you as well from management and other teachers for students to basically just rattle through all these lessons when they've not learned. Make sure that your students' progress is logged. Make sure that you are accurately and adequately maintaining standards of examination for your students whilst you're doing this. So making sure that they understand everything. Now, this doesn't need to be like a written test. It can be something as simple as going around the class with key learning points at the end of each lesson, noting down anything that students by and large had struggled with, and then reintroducing that in the next lesson. But being patient with them, not running things too fast if you can see that they're struggling, and keeping an eye and keeping a log of individual students' needs. There are, of course, several practical expectations that need to be done as well. So these are things like having your lessons planned well in advance and checked with colleagues. If you're in a public school, a lot of this is going to be planning your lessons in line with the last Chinese English lesson that they had, and making sure that you check that with the Chinese teacher. Remember asking them if they can go through it with you, because very often, if they're not told by their manager to do it, they won't. So remember, you've got to ask a lot of the time for a lot of these things. Ensuring students' progress is logged, information on individual standards is suitably organised again as well. That's really important, making sure that you are organised in how you're logging students' progress. I used to like to use a spreadsheet for each of my classes. Each of my classes had a separate spreadsheet with students' attainment marked on that. But a lot of different teachers do it in different ways. Going through how several senior expat teachers might be logging their students' progress is a really good idea. You've got to be ready to adapt to last minute changes. This is just a fact of life in China. Things change like that. You've got to be ready to, if you're in a private language center, do a demo class with 1 to 4 students who are interested in learning. So having a demo class idea in your head that you practice with your colleagues and that you're ready to just roll out is something that's really important. Having the patience to be able to deal with these things as and when they appear. You may be asked to run an activity or a game with a bunch of students that you've had 5 to 10 minutes to organize. So during your initial training, speaking with teachers about what they do within these situations and what kind of games they might use within these situations as well. We've had, you will sometimes have situations in China where, say, PE class is doing something and their PE teacher suddenly has to run away because a child is sick. They grab you and say, you need to come and teach PE now. And so being ready and prepared to have things like English games that are very active that you can use is really important for dealing with these last minute stand-in situations that you may very well expect to come up against. But importantly as well, incredibly importantly as well, putting the interests of the school and workplace harmony as a priority. So there's a few points to this. The first point is remembering the notion of authority and hierarchy within China. If you have an issue or a problem with a task that you have been given, making sure you are incredibly diplomatic with it, ideally going through a Chinese colleague who's on the same level as you if you are addressing management, because that is an upper level. Addressing management directly with issues that you might have or differences you might have on something they've asked you to do can sometimes be misinterpreted as being an insult or causing them to lose face. Also taking pride in the school of where you are. So engaging and participating in activities like presentations, fairs, different performances they might do for parents throughout the year. They might include volunteering to be part of a teacher choir, singing songs for things like that, or helping students do a little play. And also as well, making sure that you adhere to the rules, regulations, norms and laws of China, not bringing in political points within classrooms, not talking about sensitive issues with students in a classroom setting, making sure that you are really focusing on the task at hand. And then have any questions on expectations for teachers in China? I'm just going to pop another poll there as well for you all. Oh, sorry, that seems to have cut off some of the question. So the question here is, I don't know why it's cut it off the end. The question here is, what do you think will be your most important job role? So the most important function of your job as a foreign teacher in China? Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty much bang on. To teach students to better communicate is broadly the most important aspect. Another one that you could say is relatively important is to help students, to help make students more aware of living in the global environment. That is another very important function, but that's a relatively passive function that you will have throughout your time teaching there as well. But yeah, 100% teach students better communicate. That's absolutely right. Okay. Now, it's really important to think about cultural awareness at work. We've just touched on that very briefly, but there are a few different points to this. One is workplace etiquette. This is directly associated with cross-cultural understanding. We'll go very in depth next week on our session on life outside work, Chinese culture and immersion on this. But workplace etiquette is very important. Understanding, as I mentioned earlier, notions of hierarchy, authority, being able to get on well with your colleagues. Now, what you bring to a lot of things as a Western teacher and a Western worker is flexibility and adaptability, and also critical thinking, coming up with new ideas. Within meetings with people who are of higher levels of authority, if you can come up with creative ideas, they will be incredibly open to them. China is a great country if you want to take an idea and run with it. As a foreign teacher, authority, as long as you do not question their idea, or as long as you do not negatively disparage their ideas. If you have ideas for your classroom, you will be supported with them. They will help you implement them, and there is an expectation that you will contribute in that sense as well. So trying to come up continually with ideas of how things can be improved, of how you can work a lot better, of how your classes can run in a smoother way. China is considerably less individually and self-focused and more focused on a group. And within that group, hierarchy and authority are incredibly important, but also helping others is as well. When you're working in China, you'll find that pretty much every single one of your colleagues will bend over backwards to help you. They'll do just generally random, really nice little things, like get you treats to eat, continually check up on you, making sure that you're healthy, making sure that you're happy, making sure that you're working well. It's very sweet. And a lot of that kind of behavior leads to reciprocity, but remembering to help lead that behavior to reciprocity as well. So doing nice things for colleagues, maybe take them out for a meal, maybe invite them out with some of your friends to some places where the expats go, and take them up on their offers as well. A lot of colleagues will want you to be part of their inner circle, of their sort of family and friends, and will want you to come and eat out with them and their family and introduce you to people like that. Remember that being part of that whole and part of that community is a really important part of the China experience in and of itself. And doing that with work colleagues is very important. Now, issues within China need to be dealt with sensitively. There is a bit of a north-south divide in China on this. In the north, sometimes you can see quite direct arguments that occur because of differences that Chinese colleagues may have among themselves, whereas in the south, things tend to go a little more sort of wiggly-waggly. Dealing with issues sensitively is important in the sense in which you don't go necessarily straight to the source if you have a problem with something that management is saying. Discuss it with other people, raise it in a diplomatic manner, don't raise it with too strong a language, and submit your own ideas to things as well. Relationships at work are absolutely key. Maintaining good relationships, being friendly, being generous, and offering to help as well. Even if you're not asked, offering to help your Chinese teachers if there's anything they're struggling with, if there's any words or any areas of English they're struggling with when you're outside of your classes. This is incredibly well appreciated and helps you fit in better to that group mentality within China as well. When it comes to resolving issues, you've got to ensure discretion and privacy, first of all. Never do anything in front of a large group of people. Never look to humiliate anyone or have anyone feel as though they've lost face in a particular situation in front of people if you have an issue. Even if you're in a meeting, maybe take someone to one side and chat about it with them privately. Be careful not to appear confrontational as well. This is especially important with figures of authority. So again, speaking calmly, smiling is very important. A huge amount of communication in China happens via body language, but also via facial expression. Very often you'll notice Chinese people can be very strong with their expressions in their faces when they're angry or when they're happy. So keeping a warm, friendly feel when you have differences is really, really important, because as soon as your face changes, they notice that, and it creates a much more severe environment and a much more detrimental feeling within a group. Those feelings in China can stick around a lot longer than they do in countries like the UK and the US as well. Remain respectful and diplomatic at all times. So again, just drilling that point home, really being respectful in the language that you use, being soft in how you speak, and making sure that you show that you appreciate what is being done or what is being said, but you think maybe we could go in this direction as well, or on top of that. Do your research as well before raising a complaint. Speak with colleagues, teachers, other foreigners before speaking with the person you want to broach your complaint with, and asking them, how do you think it's best to approach this particular person at this juncture? Maintaining relationships and ensuring face is safe for all sides is incredibly important, and you can do that through these points. We will talk a lot more about Chinese core cultural concepts next Friday with things like face or mianzi and connections, guanxi. But ensuring that you retain those relationships and keep that face saved is very, very important. And the best way you can do it is by looking at those steps and really adhering to them as much as possible. So does anyone have any questions on cross-cultural awareness in China? Okay. Well, next week, we are going to be looking at life outside work, Chinese culture and immersion. With this, we're going to be taking a really, really good look at core cultural concepts in China. We're going to be taking a look at history in China. We're going to be taking a look at a lot of do's and don'ts when living and working in China that are hopefully going to be important for you. We're also going to be taking a look at how expats tend to live in China. What are the kinds of places you can go? What are the kinds of things you can do? What's the stuff that you can expect when you get there?